Hey everybody, welcome to week 5 of PS398. I know it's hard to believe, but by the end of this stupid video, you'll be 1/3 of the way through the stupid videos. That's crazy when you think about it. It just seems like we just got started. And you're like, oh, you're not supposed to say that till the end. I know, shut up. And I thought that it would be a nice way to celebrate getting to the end of the first third of the class in our course about international relations. I thought it'd be neat to talk about how multiple nations might interact with one another. You know, up to this point, we've had a very one-state approach to this sort of thing, right? So week 1 was just, hey, what are the building blocks? Weeks 2 and 4 were about an individual decision maker explicitly, right? So in week 2, we talked about the vanilla theory of rational choice, where we've got a set of alternatives and each one is a sure thing. And we saw that it wasn't very hard for us to come up with a relatively acceptable way to think about what consistent behavior is. What do we think, what are we willing to say that we're going to assume about individual decision maker in that world with a finite set of alternatives where everything is a sure thing. And then in week 4, we enriched that theory with the triangle of doom and said, hey, what happens if the things that we choose are not sure things? What if we're choosing among things that might be uncertain? How do we compare things that are certain with things that are uncertain? And how do we compare multiple uncertain things? Which is great news, because international relations, the international system, is a place where you really don't get to know for sure what's going to happen with many meaningful policy interventions. And then in week 3, just as a little bit of bonus content, and you're like, oh boy, bonus content, that's the way I want to view classes like this, is there's bonus content. So a little bit of our bonus content in week 3 was, well, it's going to be hard for us to go from flesh and blood individuals like you and me to societies that are equally consistent, right? So weeks 2 and 4 were about what is consistent behavior for individuals. And then week 3 suggested that the route that we take to go from individuals to societies, that's a very circuitous route that's difficult. It's a difficult to navigate process, and there isn't one good way up that particular mountain. And it's come time for us to talk about how multiple states interact with one another. We're going to talk about other actors too, but I think it's going to be easiest to motivate things today if we think about this as multiple states. And there's all sorts of interesting interactions between states, right? I mean, so the one that comes to mind the most for a conflict scholar like me is conflict. I think about war, but that certainly isn't the only way that states interact with one another. They trade with one another, they establish deals with one another, they have international organizations with one another, they might join an alliance, they might be part of a sanction together, they might issue tariffs to one another. There's all sorts of different things that states do to one another. And it's going to be important for us to have a good framework for thinking about sort of the nature of any given interaction between two states. And actually, there's a little bit of promise in thinking about a unified framework for thinking about all the different kinds of interactions between states. The reason I say that is this again goes back to Karl von Clausewitz, who in his famous treatise on war issued a claim that is very often quoted in international relations, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. To repeat, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Now, what does that mean? What that means is war is a purpose-driven action. War is a policy that somebody chooses. It is one policy instrument out of some set of policy instruments. Presumably somebody starts a war for some reason. And Clausewitz says, well, the reasons for war are political. This is an international political phenomenon, right? So war is the continuation of politics, not of economics, not of any other sort of interaction. It's the continuation of politics by other means. And that's good because all of the other interactions between states seem far more political prima facie than war does, right? Just as an example, going to the United Nations and voting seems pretty political, right? Issuing some decree, that's a political action. Trade is an economic action, but it also involves lots of politics at the domestic level. We oftentimes see that domestic politics, a lot of the fervor within domestic politics is about what international trade policy ought to be. Should there be tariffs? Should there be protectionism or something like that? Underneath the surface level economic aspects of trade, there's some very deeply political actions just in terms of the units in question. How do the countries that create trade deals come up with their preferences? That's a political problem. And then how do they negotiate those trade deals? That's also a political problem, not just an economic one. So an interesting follow-up question then is, what is politics? Well, Clausewitz said it. I mean, he said politics, or he said something in German that's been translated to politics. What is politics? And I'm not going to get too deep into that, okay? You probably heard 10 million different definitions in your introductory political science classes. I don't believe any of those. I don't know what any of that means. I don't know what politics is. It's not like I have a PhD in political science or anything. Who knows what politics is? However, one useful way to think about politics, especially as it begins to enter into some of these economic things, is as bargaining. Bargaining is an interesting class of economic interaction, right? So how many of us, I'm told to try to improve participation in classes. So how many of you, raise your hand if you have purchased something at a grocery store or a mini mart or some other standard purveyor of goods? You ever go to a mini mart and buy a Coke? I have. Not a Coke, Diet Coke. I love Diet Coke. So let's go through the interaction. You walk into the mini mart. You're dazzled by the options. Every beverage there that could slake even the thirstiest thirst. You are dazzled by the choices. And yet, you know, oh, today's gonna be a Diet Coke day, like every other day. And so you go up to the cooler, you get the Diet Coke, you observe the price of the Diet Coke. It says underneath the Diet Coke, hey, this can of Diet Coke costs $1. So you get the Diet Coke. You're not deterred by the dollar. You know what? You're like, you know what? I got $1 for a Diet Coke. $1 for refreshment, I'm into that. So you get the Diet Coke. You know you're gonna owe $1. You get to the counter, and they say that'll be $1. And you say, how about 80 cents? You ever do that? You ever try to haggle at the mini mart? You ever try to haggle with somebody at the mini mart to pretend like you have some kind of bargaining power? To pretend like you can say, you know what? If you don't take this Coke for 80 cents, then you're gonna miss a sale. And they say, okay, whatever. Don't try to haggle at the mini mart. They'll look at you like you're like you and I need to have a long talk or something, okay? Don't tell, oh, Professor Carroll told me that I have to go to the mini mart and haggle with you. No, please don't do that. But it's absurd to think about, right? Because the interaction between you and the mini mart when you buy a Diet Coke, which is then implicitly an interaction between you, the mini mart, the Coca-Cola company, the distributor, all sorts of different things, right? There's implicitly a very complicated interaction between you and every entity involved with the making of that Diet Coke. However, because this is a somewhat competitive market, we all just act as price takers, right? So Coke can sell as much of Coke as they would like to at the prevailing prices, and I can buy as much as I would like to at prevailing prices. And so the price is the unique determinant of how much I'm gonna pay. I don't have bargaining power when I buy Coke. I don't have any bargaining power when I buy a Coke. Power. Think about that. Bargaining power, leverage. Conversely, I might have bargaining power when I'm buying something a little bit bigger. So if I'm buying a house or a car or something like that, I'm perfectly well within my rights to say, oh, you know what? I actually think you're a little bit overpriced, but I'd be willing to pay you some smaller number, right? So if it's not a Coke for $1, but rather a house for $100,000, you're within your rights to say, hey, I think this house is only worth $80,000, and here's my offer of $80,000. And they can accept it or reject it, which depends in large part about what they think the likelihood is that somebody else is going to come by and offer them $100,000 for a house, if that's what they were asking. When you buy a house, you may have bargaining power in ways that you don't when you buy a Diet Coke. One of those is an exchange-driven economic interaction, and one of them is a bargaining-driven, more conflictual, more political interaction where things like power, leverage, outside options enter into the conversation, right? Now, let's think about politics. So suppose that we're getting out of international relations and now we're two political parties negotiating over the budget. When we're choosing policies for the year, when we set our spending for the year, two political parties, are they acting more like Coke buyers or like house buyers? Like house buyers, they're bargaining. They're saying, you know what? You're asking for too much on this one issue, so I'm going to need a little bit of help on this other issue, right? They're haggling, they're negotiating. Which one of them is more powerful matters. Which one of them has more seats in the Congress matters. Power interfaces with this overall interaction, right? So bargaining is very intimately tied to politics, but there are also forms of economic exchange that are colored with bargaining and others that are not. We need to talk about bargaining. We need to talk about what the heck bargaining is and how we can understand it. Because it turns out that bargaining is the dominant way, the dominant unifying paradigm for thinking about all of the different ways that states can interact with one another. Bargaining is easily the way that most international relations scholars think about the underlying source code of all other interactions of international relations. Bargaining is baked into international relations the way that most IR scholars see it. And then you think about all the different kinds of bargaining that you might see between two states. You might see them bargaining on the eve of battle, trying to get themselves out of war and saying, if you don't do something, I will fight you. You're trying to say, I'm making your outside option worse. I'm imposing my leverage upon you. And if you don't accept this leverage I'm trying to impose upon you, then I will attack you. That's bargaining. There might be bargaining at the United Nations when multiple states at the Security Council are trying to talk about what a resolution ought to look like. They argue very hard about diction. They are very concerned about which words are included because the language of international diplomacy is so loaded that missing any given word can be disastrous. Consequently, there's a lot of bargaining that goes into the creations of these resolutions. Think about a trade war. Think about a president of the United States going to a president of China and saying, hey, we need to hammer out the details of a trade deal. That is bargaining. Think about what happens at the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, right? When we're trying to figure out what the appropriate way to punish either a state or an individual is. At that point in time, when we're thinking about what the appropriate punishment is for some high-level, well-known person, a political celebrity of some form, there is bargaining involved with what is the appropriate course of action for punishment. Think about if an international organization wanted to conduct business. Suppose that you're Amnesty International or something and you would like to have some project in some country. You don't just go into the country and say, we're having a project. You have to request permission. You have to set terms for what that interaction will be. There is bargaining between governments and organizations. So bargaining is everywhere. It's not like Diet Coke. International relations has remarkably little to do with Diet Coke a lot of the time. Now, think about it on a day-by-day basis. On a day-by-day basis, with billions of transactions happening all the time, there's a lot of Diet Coke style transactions, lots of competitive, exchangey, win-win sort of trade. But for a lot of the things that make their way into the history books, it's bargaining that matters. So today I want to talk about bargaining. And it turns out that the best way to talk about bargaining is to start with a quick tour about the normative criterion of Pareto optimality. Pareto optimality is a relatively minimal normative criterion for the distribution of resources across multiple actors. This is a useful way to think about a lot of different things, but it turns out that there are very intimate connections between the normative criterion of Pareto optimality and this bargaining thing that I'm talking to you about. Whatever bargaining is, it's intimately related to Pareto optimality for reasons that you'll see by the end of today's lecture. It turns out that a good sense about Pareto optimality and bargaining will also help us to get a sense about what exchange looks like. So we will get a sense about exchange relative to conflict, or trade relative to bargaining. We'll get a sense about what that interaction looks like after having defined. So you'll actually have a very clear sense about the difference between conflict and exchange, which will be a recurring theme this week and next. And so I think that this is a nice way to think about sort of the underlying geometry of the interactions between states. So I'm really looking forward to showing you some of this stuff. So in the A block, I want to talk about Pareto optimality. Again, this is a normative criterion for the allocation of resources between multiple actors. I'll try to introduce this very intuitively, but we'll also end up with a formal definition about what Pareto optimality is that's related to some of what we saw with the other use of the P word throughout Arrow's theorem, right? So we saw weak Pareto and the Pareto extension rule. That didn't come out of nowhere. These are related to this underlying notion of Pareto optimality. And this notion of Pareto optimality then is very useful for talking about bargaining. So we'll make sure that we pin down what the concept of optimality is, and also sort of how would we know it when we saw it. In the B block, we'll talk about bargaining and what makes bargaining bargaining. Just do me a favor right now, pause the video if you need to, and just tell me, if you can, what makes bargaining bargaining, because I'm going to tell you in the B block, and I want to see if you would come up with a better definition than I had. So what is bargaining? What makes bargaining bargaining? How would you know bargaining when you saw it? How would you be able to compare two separate bargaining problems? And then the C block, I want to introduce a very useful graphical tool that is going to help us to visualize multidimensional bargaining. Oh my goodness, multidimensional bargaining. It's going to help us to see multidimensional bargaining and also to juxtapose conflict and exchange, realism and liberalism, economics and politics, all of this in one interesting rectangle named the Edgeworth Box. And so I'm really looking forward to showing you just what this all looks like in a very... So it might take a second, it's a little bit subtle, you might not see everything the first time and you're like, yeah, that's not very hard for me to believe, fat man. Shut up, you're doing great. I don't know if you noticed, but you're doing great. You are doing great. If it was easy, then it wouldn't be worth it. And the Edgeworth Box is one of the ultimate, and if it isn't easy, then it's not worth it, because you really get to see some beautiful things happen once you learn how to use this rectangle. So we're going to talk about bargaining. We're going to talk about optimality. We're going to talk about conflict and exchange, realism and liberalism, economics and political science. All sorts of interesting juxtapositions await. I can't wait to get into it. Can you? Let's get started. So here in the A block, I want to talk about Pareto optimality. Sometimes you see this referred to as Pareto efficiency. Efficiency is probably the better term for it, but I've said optimality a few times now already, so I'm going to stick with optimality. But if you see efficiency, that's synonymous. Write that down now because this will save you like 10 Piazza questions later. Oh, you said optimality one time and efficiency the other. What did you mean? These words are interchangeable. So I want to introduce this by way of example. I'm holding a dish, and the dish says total on it. So there's a dish. This is the total amount of resources. And what's in here but 10 pennies. Okay? 10 pennies are in here. I counted them several times. Counting really isn't much of a strong suit. We're going to say the total amount of resources to be allocated is 10 pennies. There's 10 pennies in the world. Okay? This is not a great world, but it's early. This is turn 2 of our Civ game. I have another dish. It says A on it. This is going to be state A. This is country A. And as of right now, they don't have any resources. I have another one. It says state B. This is state B's resources and it's empty. So as of right now, I've got 2 countries that don't have anything. And I've got some resources that I, a social planner, will call it. I'm a social planner. I'm the god of this world with these 2 countries. And so in these 2 countries, I'm going to be the person that determines where the pennies go. And the idea here is the countries get happier and happier as you give them more and more pennies. More pennies, more happy. Let's think about every possible way that I could divvy the pennies up in these 2 dishes. All right, let's think about every possible way I could divvy the pennies up. Here, right now, this is a possible allocation. Do you see this? This is possible. I know it's possible because this is what we're doing. That's heavy when you think about it. So I know that this is a possible world because I'm in it. Somebody called Descartes. One possible allocation of resources between these 2 countries is that neither of them has any pennies. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little graph. And on this axis, I'm going to have how many pennies does country A have. And on this axis, I'm going to have how many pennies does country B have. And because there's a possibility of no pennies, I'm going to have a dot at 0, 0. That's the 0, 0 dot. Right here is the 0, 0 dot. And this represents the allocation, that represents this situation where neither country has any pennies. This is the only time I get to do this with both of them. Well, I guess I could, but then they wouldn't have any pennies again because of gravity. Now, suppose that I decide, in my infinite wisdom as social planner, as god of these 2 countries' world, I decide to take 1 penny. Let's rub the penny's nose for good luck before our problem set. I take the penny and I give it to country A. This is a possible allocation of pennies. Country A has 1 penny, country B has no pennies. This is possible. This is possible. I know it's possible because here it is. I'm not going to move up because I didn't give country B any pennies, but I could go to 0, 1. That's a possible allocation as well. It could have been 2. It could have been 3. It could have been 4. It could have been 5. It could have been 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In other words, I can have no pennies for state B and 0, 1, 2, ... 10 pennies for country A. So anywhere along this axis, I can have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Suppose that we're feeling a little bit more magnanimous. And so I'm going to go back to, now everything's back everything's total again. So I've got, right now we're empty again. Now suppose instead that I gave country B, state B now has 1 penny. You can tell by how I have to hold it up. 1 penny for country B. That's a possible allocation. That's 0, 1. Right, so I go up 1 from 0, 0. Let's just keep at it. Let's take poor country A, who right now has nothing, and let's think about how many pennies we can give country A. Well, they can have 1. Now I'm at 1, 1. 2, 1. 3, 1. 4, 1. I'm still giving these countries to state A. These pennies. I'm not giving countries to countries. That's weird. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I'm out. There were only 10 pennies. There were only 10 pennies. There were only 10 pennies. So now I've got an allocation where I've got 1 penny for state B and 9 for state A. And I hit everything along the line. So I have this whole row where it went 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But now it's 9. It is impossible for me to have 1 penny for country B and 10 for country A, because that's more pennies than I have to give. This total is a scarcity constraint. There's only so many pennies. There's only so many resources that I can divvy out. So if I give 1 to country B, then I can only give up to 9 to country A. If I had given 2 to country B, this 2 row, then I could only give up to 8. I could give 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 to country A, and so on. So if you fill in all of the possibilities, we wind up with this triangle where every dot that constitutes this triangle, every little dot is a possible way for me to hold up these 2 dishes with how many pennies are in them. Every possible way of holding up the dishes is called an allocation. It's how much country A has and how much country B has. And these allocations are what we're concerned about right now, right? We are concerned with these allocations. Now I want to call your particular attention to just some interesting things going on inside of this triangle. Okay, this triangle has a lot going on. So for example, consider an allocation where country A has 3, there's 1, 2, 3, and country B has 3, 1, 2, 3. So suppose I'm at the point 3, 3, which is in the interior of this triangle. Okay, I'm going to highlight 3, 3. That means that there are 4 pennies left over in the total. Okay, there are 4 pennies left over in the total. So from 3, 3, let's just zoom in on 3, 3. And I want to talk about allocations that are close to it and better. Okay, so here we are at the 3, 3 dot. Notice that if I had 1 more penny, I'm taking this from the total jar. So now I've got 1 more penny. So I could give it to country A, in which case I would go to the east 1 dot, and I would find myself at 4, 3 instead of 3, 3. So that's a possibility. Notice that if I did that, if I took us from 3, 3 to 4, 3, I just made country A happier. Note also that country B is no sadder. Country B is no sadder because country B wants to go north, and all that we did was make a horizontal move. So country B gets happier this way and sadder this way, but all that I did was go this way. I didn't do anything with north or south. Conversely, back at 3, 3, I could have taken that penny that I just gave to country A. Now they've got 3 again. I'm back at 3, 3. I've got a penny to give. I could have given it to country B. And I could have moved north to 3, 4. So here I am at 3, 4. Note also that I just made country B happier because we went north, but I didn't move east or west. So country A is no happier or sadder than they were at 3, 3. So in other words, it's possible for me at certain dots like 3, 3. At 3, 3, I could make at least one country happier without making the other country sadder. There's a possibility in a weak sense for win-win. I could make one party strictly win and the other party indifferent. Now, because I was at 3, 3, I could have had 2 pennies out of the total jar. So I could have been at 3, 3 and then taken 2 pennies out of the total. And if I had taken 2 pennies out of the total, I would get myself to 4, 4, which is 1 to the northeast. So that's a strict win-win. Now both parties are strictly better off than they were at 3, 3. Now suppose I was at 5, 5. So now I've got 5 in each and my total is empty. The total is empty. This is a big deal. Total is empty. Are you with me? Total is empty because there's 5 and there's 5. Now, suppose that I'm feeling pretty good. I, the social planner, am feeling really good because I have found, I've divvied all the pennies. But then you're my boss apparently. I'm the god of this world, but you're my boss. I'm Darth Vader and you're the Emperor. You come up to me and you say, oh, neat job divvying the pennies, but guess what? I need state A to be 6 happiness. I need them to have 6 pennies at least. And right now, state A only has 5 pennies. So I've got to re-divvy the pennies. I, the social planner, now have to re-divvy the pennies because I need to make, maybe 5 isn't happy enough. Maybe at 5 happiness points, state A is like, you know what? I'm going to start a war with everybody. So maybe they're not happy enough. So how am I going to make them happier? I'm out of pennies. What do I do? How am I going to get a strict improvement in state A when I don't have any pennies to give? Now, look with me at the graph. In the triangle, there exist allocations where state A has 6 or more. Let me highlight those. So here are all of the allocations where state A has 6 or more. However, none of them involve state B having 5 pennies. They only go so high in the triangle. Right? So I can find all sorts of ways to get this many, but because of the slope of because the triangle has that scarcity constraint, because of this frontier, because of the fact that I only had 10 pennies to give, there exist allocations where if I want to make one country strictly happier, I have to make the other one sadder. I have to take a penny from state B. Now they have 4. And I give it to state A. Now think about that. Something very profound just happened. Because I went from 5-5, and you ordered me to make state A happier. You said, make sure the state A has 6, because otherwise state A is going to issue problem. I might have just won the Nobel Peace Prize because I just pacified an angry state. I just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you very much for all the help. I'd like to thank the little people and Chewie. But in order to do so, I had to take something away from state B. They're sitting here thinking, boy, it's neat that Rob's getting all these accolades, but I think he's a bit of an asshole. Why? Because I had to take away. It was impossible for me. Once I was at the frontier, it was impossible for me to make one country strictly happier without making the other country strictly sadder. At 3-3, I could do that. At 3-3, if you had told me at 3-3, hey, make sure that state A has 4, I could have just taken one out of the total. At 3-3, I had pennies to play with. At 5-5, I didn't because I was already on the frontier. It's impossible for me to go north. It's impossible for me to go east. It's impossible for me to go northeast. That frontier, that scarcity frontier, the fact that I had only 10 pennies to play with. If I had infinite pennies, this would be easy, but I don't have infinite pennies. In the absence of that, this frontier is qualitatively different. This frontier is qualitatively different because at this frontier, everything is zero sum. There is no win-win. Inside the triangle, 3-3, win-win exists. There are win-win opportunities at 3-3. I could go to 4-3, I could go to 3-4, I could go to 4-4. However, at the frontier, there are no opportunities for win-win, nor even for weak win-win. I can't make one party strictly happier while keeping everybody else indifferent. This is different than the inside of the triangle. This Pareto frontier is different from the rest of the triangle. It's different for that substantive tweak. The fact that along the frontier, I can only make zero-sum trades, whereas inside of the triangle, I can find win-win. Just to show you how this all works, what we're going to end up defining here in just a second is that every allocation along this frontier, be it 10-0, 0-10, 5-5, or anything else along the frontier, all of these allocations, all of these possible ways of holding up 2 bulls, all of these are going to be what we call Pareto optimal. This is our normative criterion du jour. So let me define Pareto optimality, and then we'll see exactly what it looks like in the context of the triangle. So a formal definition of Pareto optimality is the following. Suppose I have some set of alternatives x. In the previous example, the set of alternatives was the set of all allocations, the whole triangle. This is the set of all allocations. Suppose I have some set of alternatives. Call it x. We say that some alternative, call it little x, is Pareto dominated. There exists some other alternative, call it little y. So x is dominated by y. X is dominated by y. Allocation x is dominated by allocation y. If for every individual, the utility of y is at least as high as the utility of x. So everybody at y is at least as well off as they were at x. And there exists at least one individual, call them J. There exists at least one individual such that y is strictly better than x. And if an alternative is not Pareto dominated, we call it Pareto optimal. So let's go back to our picture and see what that looks like. Start from 0, 0. Do any alternatives Pareto dominate 0, 0? Do there exist any dots that Pareto dominate 0, 0? Yes, as a matter of fact. 1, 0 dominates it. 0, 1 dominates it. 1, 1 dominates it. Actually, everything dominates it. 0, 0 is like the worst. So 0, 0 is dominated. What about 1, 0? Is 1, 0 Pareto optimal? Well, no, because I can find other alternatives that Pareto dominated. Because I can go to the north to 1, 1, and that Pareto dominates 1, 0. I can go to the east to 2, 0, and that Pareto dominates. Or I can go to the northeast to 2, 1, and that Pareto dominates 1, 0. So 1, 0 is dominated as well. Right? So visually, an alternative is dominated if there exists another alternative that is either north, east, or northeast. So in fact, what makes the triangle is the fact that everything on the inside, everything other than the Pareto frontier, everything inside the triangle, what makes the interior is that there's something north, something east, or something northeast. So everything here is Pareto dominated by some other alternative. It might be multiple alternatives. All you have to do is find one alternative that Pareto dominates. However, along the frontier, the whole point of the frontier is that I can't go north, I can't go east, and I can't go northeast. So the triangle, the edge of the triangle, the frontier of the triangle, this Pareto frontier, these are all of the allocations that are not Pareto dominated. And because they are not Pareto dominated, they are Pareto optimal. So in terms of my example, a sufficient condition for an allocation being Pareto optimal is that there's nothing in my total dish. This is why you sometimes see this referred to as Pareto efficiency. What makes this efficient is that no resources were left on the table. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was in the total jar at the end. Everything ended up being allocated. It might not have been a very fair allocation, but it was an allocation where everything was used. It was efficient. Much like with Arrow's theorem, this is a good chance for us to talk about competing normative goals, right? So consider the allocation 10, 0. What do you think about that allocation? You can pause the video if you need to. Reflect. What do you think about this dot? And you're like, I don't have thoughts about dots. Oh, give me 10 more weeks. You'll have thoughts about dots. What do you think about that dot? Let me give you a clue. It's Pareto optimal. It's no less Pareto optimal than any other Pareto optimal alternative. And the Pareto dominates lots of alternatives. If Pareto dominates 9, 0, 8, 0, 7, 0, 6, 0, 5, 0, 4, 0, 3, 0, 2, 0, 1, 0, and 0, 0. If Pareto dominates 10 alternatives. So is it good? Do you think it's good? Good. I'm using the word good again. Oh man, when he uses good, we're in trouble. I don't think this is a very good allocation, personally. That's just me. I tend not to like allocations where one state has everything and another state has nothing. It's personal preference. Maybe you have a similar personal preference. This is sort of like the Eurovian dictator of our non-doom triangle, right? So here, state A has everything and state B has nothing. State B might as well not exist. They don't have any pennies. The whole point of being a country apparently is to have pennies. And we could have flipped the switch and made it 0, 10 and the same thing. Again, Pareto optimal, but not very egalitarian. What would egalitarian look like in our triangle? Which are the egalitarian outcomes? Which are the egalitarian allocations? There's 0, 0. That's egalitarian, but also kind of crappy, right? There's 1, 1. There's 2, 2. There's 3, 3. There's 4, 4. There's 5. Everywhere along this 45-degree line is egalitarian. So look, I've got two lines. One line is the efficiency line. If you're along this line, if you're along the Pareto frontier, then you are a Pareto efficient allocation. Apparently, allocations can be personified now. Congratulations on being an allocation. You're like, oh, I always wanted to be something. However, there's this other line, which you'll notice goes in a different direction. And this line, which goes in it is perpendicular. This line is perpendicular. It is orthogonal. So here's this orthogonal egalitarian line. 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 5. So in this triangle, we can visualize two competing normative interests, efficiency and egalitarianism. Efficiency has nothing to do with the distribution of resources. When I say that Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality is a minimal normative criterion, that's what I mean. It's a minimal normative criterion because it has nothing to say about the distribution of resources other than everything has been distributed. The social planner at a Pareto optimal outcome has nothing else to do, in the sense that if they did anything else, it would involve taking away. They would have to zero sum it. There are no more win-win opportunities. Now consider the allocation 4-4. 4-4 is Pareto dominated by 5-5, therefore it is not Pareto optimal. However, it is egalitarian. So So here's a personal question for you, and I'm not going to tell you your answer because how you weigh competing normative interests is your business and not mine. But now that you've seen this, tell me, how do you feel about 4-4 versus 5-4? How do you feel about 4-4 versus 4-5? How do you feel about 4-4 versus 5-5, 6-4, and 4-6? Which is to say, how do you compare waste and fairness? What ought to be the determining factors, if any? What tells you what your favorite outcome is along the frontier? And does the thing that told you what your favorite outcome is along the frontier, does that rule that you just used to say what your favorite outcome is along the frontier, does it help you to compare something on the frontier to something below the frontier? It might not. You might need another part of it. You might not know it, but the rule that you used to come up with your preferences, it might need to be enriched. It might need to be updated. Because seeing things this way, it's very stark. I don't know about you, but I get tingles when I think about this. Like, it's just exciting. It's exciting to see something so profound in some stupid triangle that came about because of dishes. Isn't that awesome? So what I want to show you in the B block is there's an intimate connection between this criterion of get me to the frontier and the processes that we call bargaining processes. So I'll see you there. What is bargaining? I asked you in the intro to come up with a good definition of bargaining, and nothing interesting happened in the interim, so your brain has had nothing to do but think about that. The usual definition of bargaining involves two steps. Two things combined to make bargaining bargaining. I can tell you bargaining in 2 steps. Not 1, not 3, 2 steps. 2 steps. 2 things make bargaining bargaining. Now that you've had 2, maybe you need to pause the video and think about what could be the 2 things that help you to disentangle bargaining from other sorts of political interactions, economic interactions, and so on. What makes bargaining bargaining? This is important because, like, we're going to be talking about war as if it's bargaining. We're going to be talking about trade relations as if they're bargaining. What makes bargaining bargaining? What makes buying a house different from buying a Coke? Here's a hint. There are no shows on any cable networks entitled Coke Hunters, nor Coke Hunters International. What makes bargaining bargaining? What makes bargaining bargaining? Bargaining. This is a word that you've used before. Bargaining. You probably have bargained. What makes bargaining bargaining? Somebody's gonna be like, hey, what was college like the year that nobody went to college? And you're like, oh, all I did was watch this random fat man who was sitting in his house saying, what makes bargaining bargaining? What makes bargaining bargaining? Twofold answer. 1, the parties have competing interests. When you go to buy a car, bargaining is involved when one buys a car. Or at the very least, you can try. If you go up to a car dealer and say, I'm not going to give you full price for that car, that offends the car dealer far less than if you go up to a mini mart attendant and say, I'm not going to give you full price for that Diet Coke. Right? They would look at you like you need to go. Whereas, you know, the car dealer would just, there's some person 8 rooms back from the front that has to go be talked to. That's the person that has all the answers. You're not allowed to talk to that person. So when you go to buy a car, you say, I want to give you less money for that car. Why? Because you want to get the car as cheaply as possible. And when the car dealer counters back and say, actually, you need to give me more money than what you just offered. Why? Because they want to sell the car for as much as possible. So of all of the outcomes that involve you getting the car, you like the outcomes where you got the car and gave them less money, and they like the outcome more where you got the car and you gave them more money. Every dollar that you save is a dollar that the car dealer loses. Every dollar that you save is a dollar that the car dealer lost. Every dollar that the car dealer gets off of you is a dollar that you lost. It's a dollar for dollar, zero sum sort of thing. I lose a dollar, you get a dollar. You lose a dollar, I get a dollar. Competing interests. 2, the other thing that makes bargaining bargaining, and actually this is really the straw stirring the drink, is that disagreement is costly. So if we fail to reach a bargain, then bad things happen. So let's say we're buying a car again. So if I'm buying a car off of you, you're the car dealer, I'm the car buyer. Suppose that we fail to reach a deal. We're haggling over some car. And I want to save money and you want me to not save money. You want to get money. And we're haggling, and eventually we say, you know what, screw it. I'm not going to buy this car. I'm not going to sell this car. We're done with this interaction. Now what happens? Well, you just put a lot of time into somebody that didn't buy a car from you, and you have a quota to hit. There's a certain number of cars that you need to sell, or that you get some commission. So if you don't sell the car, you don't make money. That car is a liability to you until you've sold it. You have to take care of it. You have to wax it. You have to keep the bird off of it. You have to do all sorts of things to that car. You want to sell that car. You want to sell the car. I'm here to make a deal, says everybody on Shark Tank. I'm here to make a deal. So you want to sell the car. If you don't sell the car, then you just lost a commission. And if I don't buy the car, I got to walk home. We both want to make a deal. You want to make a deal and get a commission. I want to make a deal and have a car. But we have competing interests over these things, right? So disagreement is costly, but we have competing interests. So there's no easy way for us to make an agreement because we have competing interests. That's what makes bargaining bargaining. How do we encode that? How do we encode that there are competing interests, but the disagreement is costly? Well, let's think about it this way. Suppose that I've got some set of alternatives, call it X. And just to animate things, let's do like we had in the bargaining model of war. U for country A of any X is X, and U for country B of any X is 1 minus X. Now notice, what makes one party happier makes the other party sadder. In order to make country A happier, I need to make X get bigger. And in order to make country B happier, I need to make X get smaller. And everything that makes country A 1 unit happier makes country B 1 unit sadder. Right? So this is competing interests. They have competing interests. Now let's think about what that looks like in a picture. There's a two-dimensional space. All right? And on this axis, I'm going to have the utility for country A. And on this axis, I'm going to have the utility for country B. And let me think about what the utility imputation, that's just a combination of everybody's utilities. Let's plot all of the utility imputations of this interaction. All right? So suppose that X equals 0. If X equals 0, then country A gets 0 happiness points because U of A of X is X. So UA of 0 is 0. And country B gets 1 happiness point because UB of X is 1 minus X. So that's 1 minus 0, that's 1. Similarly, if I had X equals 1, then country A has 1 happiness point and country B has 0 happiness points. If X was a half, country A would have a half happiness point and country B would have a half a happiness point, 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 half a happiness point. If X was 3/4, then A would have 3/4 and B would have 1/4. In other words, I'm developing a frontier. It's a line. It's just a line. I've got a line. It goes from 1, 0 to 0, 1. And anywhere in between is just right on this line. I should note that if I had risk-averse countries, if I had countries whose utility functions were what we call concave, if I had countries that preferred sure things to risky alternatives, then this figure would change a little bit because I would wind up with a bendy outward one. So in the case of risk neutrality, we wind up with a straight line. With risk aversion, we have more possibilities, or we have further out possibilities. So just to keep things a little bit more general, I'll just have this bendy outward one. All that means is I've got some risk-averse countries. I have now encoded what competing interests look like. In order for me to make one country happier along this line, I had to make the other country sadder. Well, that's starting to sound very familiar. So in other words, bargaining problems are those where we've got implicitly, it creates a Pareto frontier. Bargaining problems create a Pareto frontier. We are negotiating over where on the frontier we're going to find ourselves. If we choose an X, if we choose some border between the two countries, if we choose some tax rate, if we choose some price for the car, all that does is put us at one and only one spot along this line. 2, disagreement is costly. What does that mean? Disagreement is costly. Disagreement is costly. Well, that means that if we fail to make an agreement, we will wind up at something called the disagreement point, which I will call capital D. And the idea with the disagreement point is that it's some amount x and some amount y, somewhere on this axis, somewhere on this axis, that is strictly southwest of the frontier. Disagreement is strictly southwest of the frontier. So in other words, if we fail to make an agreement, then we wind up at this disagreement point, and the idea is that it is Pareto dominated by at least some of the alternatives along the frontier. Now that we have this picture, I can give you a precise sense about what I mean when I say bargaining power. So let's consider for any disagreement point. So right now I've got a frontier and I've got a disagreement point. That's a bargaining problem. That's all that a bargaining problem is some frontier and some disagreement point. So here's an interesting question. Which of the efficient alternatives, which Pareto optimal alternatives, Pareto dominate the disagreement point visually? Because those are the things that are at least as good as disagreement for both parties, and strictly better for at least one party. So here's my disagreement point. I could go directly to the east from it, and once I hit the frontier, this is a Pareto optimal alternative. The Pareto dominates disagreement, but where all I've done is make country A maximally happy, conditional on the constraint, right? So I just took the disagreement point and I said, all I'm gonna do is come up with a negotiated alternative that makes country B indifferent, at least as good, and country A strictly happier. Okay? I could have done the same thing going north-south. So let's consider the alternative, or I'm at the disagreement point and I go north. I go north until I hit the frontier. I go due north. I don't make country A any happier this time. I make country B strictly happier. And I go due north. And here is an alternative that strictly dominates the disagreement point. And the reason that it dominates the disagreement point is that country B is strictly happier and country A is indifferent between the two. And anywhere in between these 2 points makes the both parties are strictly happier to varying degrees. So this is what you wind up calling the bargaining range. The bargaining range is the set of Pareto efficient alternatives that Pareto dominate the disagreement point. This is the bargaining range. And so the basic idea here is, because disagreement is costly, we're thinking to ourselves, chances are excellent that if these two countries have successful bargaining, then they will find themselves somewhere along the bargaining range. We don't know if it's going to be something that really helps state A, something that really helps state B, or something in between. But our hypothesis right now is, as of right now, there's no reason to suspect that we won't find ourselves there. It would be a failure. It would be a failure of bargaining if we didn't get to the bargaining range. So the outcomes are going to be somewhere from here. So an interesting question is, what makes the bargaining range favor state A, and what makes the bargaining range favor state B? Well, suppose, for example, so if I'm country A and I'm buying a car, I'm buying the presidential car apparently. And suppose that if walking home was really bad, suppose I live very far away from the car dealer. Well, if that's the case, if disagreement is very costly for me, then I'm moving the disagreement point further and further and further to the west. I'm saying disagreement is really bad for me. And every time I do that, I'm making this top edge of the bargaining range get better and better and better for state B. It's getting higher and higher and worse for me. So as I lose bargaining power because my outside option gets worse, as the disagreement point gets worse and worse for me, bargaining gets better and better for you and worse for me. Similarly, if you're the car dealer who is country B, and let's say it's like the end of the month and you're short of your quota, you need to make a sale. If disagreement gets worse and worse for you as we get further and further south with the disagreement point, as I pull it south, then the relevant outcomes, the bargaining range outcomes that emerge, the new bargaining range outcomes, are good for me and bad for you. So bargaining power improves the bargaining range for you. The better your outside option, the better bargaining goes for you. The better the agreements for you will be. As an extreme case, suppose that I didn't really care if I bought the car. Suppose my disagreement point was somewhere very, very, very close to the frontier. Suppose my disagreement point is very far to the east. Well, if that's the case, then the set of alternatives that are better for me, or at least as good for me, is relatively small. And it all favors me pretty good. And the same for you if we're very far north. Bargaining power gives you better outcomes. Now, bargaining range is a set of words that we've used already in this class. Right? You might remember at the end of last week's lecture, a bargaining range emerged because two countries were thinking about fighting a war with one another. What gives? What does that mean? Well, what that means is this disagreement point in the bargaining model of war is parameterized. It's not just a D. The outside option of war for country A offers expected utility of P minus CA, and the outside option of war offers state B the expected utility of 1 minus P minus CB. Now let's think about what those mean for the disagreement point. Suppose that we have a disagreement point, P minus CA and 1 minus P minus CB. And suppose that we decided from this disagreement point to make country A a little bit stronger militarily, which is to say, let's increase P. Well, if I increase P, that moves the disagreement point to the east because that makes P minus CA get higher. And it moves it south because it makes 1 minus P minus CB get lower. And so as I increase P, I move that disagreement point. I move that disagreement point to the southeast. And therefore, any peaceful deal gets better for country A and worse for country B. And the same if I decreased P. If I made country A weaker and country B stronger, that would move the disagreement point to the northwest. It would make peaceful outcomes for country B better and for country A worse. Let me put this in clearer terms. Peace is enjoyed more by the powerful. I can choose a P. Whatever the probability of war is, whatever the probability of victory is between the two countries, that helps to set the disagreement point, which in turn helps to set the bargaining range, which in turn tells us what are the plausible outcomes that are peaceful. And what I'm saying to you is, as you make country A stronger, you make bargaining favor them. And as you make country B stronger, you make bargaining favor them. Therefore, peace is better. The peaceful outcome is better for the strong country and worse for the weak country, even though they didn't fight. That's what outside options get you. That's what bargaining gets you, is the deals do better for the party that has more bargaining power. And in international relations, under international anarchy, part of bargaining power is how strong you are. You know, while we're here, I just want to highlight the fact that the tragedy of war can be interpreted as waste in this bargaining story. Because this disagreement point and this Pareto frontier, there's space in between them. Right? So here's the disagreement point, P minus CA and 1 minus P minus CB, where that's determined in part by the probabilities and in part by the costs. So I've got space depending on the P's and the C's. I've got space in between the frontier and the disagreement point. And I just want to highlight what the cause of this space is. Because it's very easy in strategic international relations. You might be getting a bit of a taste for that. We try to convert phenomena, processes, history. We try to convert it into objects we know a lot about, like triangles and lines. And so here, this is just a line. All this line is the space between disagreement and bargaining and the bargaining range. And every millimeter on this line, no matter if you draw it all the way east, all the way north, or somewhere northeast, every millimeter of this line is people dying. Every millimeter in this space is a salted field. Every millimeter in this space is some titanic accomplishment of mankind that we didn't achieve because we were too busy building tanks. Destroyed factories, sunk ships, crying parents. Everything in a war movie is one little millimeter on this line. I'm saying this because I don't want it to appear glib. When we take something awful and shaded and nuanced and multifaceted, and did I mention awful? Like war. I don't want you to get the impression that when we convert it into a triangle so that we can try to understand it, That is not as clinical as it looks. It's very easy to lose sight of things if we get a little bit too graphical, because it's all very fun to think about, because it's a difficult puzzle. The act of encoding is to take something very difficult and to turn it into something fun to play with. But the fact that this is a fun puzzle to try to solve doesn't mean that the puzzle is itself a good puzzle. It's a bad puzzle. And even if it wasn't war, suppose this was whether or not we come to a trade deal. Suppose this line represents not the salted fields, but rather the foregone gains of trade. If we don't trade with one another, then we don't get gains. If we disagree with one another, if we fail to come to a trade deal, then we don't get a bargaining range outcome. We wind up with something worse than that. Pareto inferior. Every millimeter here is wealth that we don't have. Development that is not achieved. The people might die here too, it just might be because they starved. Pareto optimality is a normative concern. And because it does so badly on distributional grounds, because it allows the 0-1 and the 1-0, many people look at Pareto efficiency like it's cute. And it is cute in the sense that certain outcomes are viewed as acceptable via Pareto optimality alone that seem distributionally laughable. And that's true. However, everybody that dies along one of these lines indicates that efficiency is really important too. Not leaving things on the table is important too. Not wasting is important too. Making good use of the things that we have is important too. Whether it's because we don't trade or because we fight, either way, we wasted. I think it's underappreciated these days. I think it's important for us to see this as multifaceted and nuanced, and to try to understand international processes in a way that is both sympathetic to the states that are making these awful decisions, but also aware of the fact that there are many different ways to be bad. Soapbox moment ended, but I hope that this is something that resonates with you, because bargaining is at the core of almost everything that happens in international relations. And every time we fail to make a bargain, we have done something wasteful, and that is bad. So here in the C block, I want to introduce a useful graphical apparatus that we're going to use to illustrate bargaining and also to talk about trade next week. So the idea here is I want to talk about a multi-dimensional setting. So to animate this, I'm going to talk about two countries, country A and country B. And let's say that there are two commodities in the world instead of one commodity, like pennies. So suppose that there were two commodities in the world, pennies and nickels. Oh boy. Let's just say the nickels are rarer and maybe they're better, maybe they're not, who knows. This is just the scarcer of the two resources. There are 10 pennies and 5 nickels. Now I want to think about allocations of pennies and nickels between the two countries. So I'm gonna put all my coins into the total. So now I've got 10 pennies and 5 nickels to give out. Well, let's think about every possible allocation. Here's one, it's the one where none of them have anything. Now, I'm not going to want to dig too deeply into those possibilities. We've handled that before. So I'm going to talk about only those possibilities where all of the resources are allocated, which is to say, I don't want there to be anything left in my total dish. That won't necessarily give us Pareto optimality now. Pareto optimality of one commodity meant use it all, but of multiple commodities, it's going to be more nuanced than that. You'll see what I mean in a second. Suppose that I gave country A all of the pennies. So country A has 10 pennies. And you know what? I'm feeling generous. Let's give country B all the nickels too. So country B has 10 pennies and 5 nickels, and country B has nothing. So I'm going to say that country A has 10 and 5, and country B has 0 and 0. 10, 5, 0, 0. I'm going to put that into a space. And the idea here is that I can pin down, I'm going to come up with a rectangle that is 10 pennies wide and 5 nickels tall. I'm going to come up with a 10 by 5 rectangle where any point in the rectangle is an allocation where we have used all of the resources. So the point that I just described, 10, 5, 0, 0, is going to be this northeast corner of the rectangle. I'm 10 to the right, and I'm 5 up. Now consider the situation where I took all of these resources and gave them to country B. Now country A has 0, 0, and country B has 10, 5. So I'm going to call that this southwest corner. That's going to be the situation where country B has everything and country A has nothing. So right now I've got two different allocations. The one where country A has all of the pennies and all of the nickels, and the one where country B has all of the pennies and all of the nickels. Let's just finish up the corners. So suppose that country A had no pennies but all of the nickels. So now, country A has all the nickels and country B has all the pennies. So I'm going to say that country A has 0 pennies, 5 nickels, and country B has 10 pennies, 5 nickels. Okay, this is the situation where country B has all of the pennies and country A has all of the nickels. And if I switch them, then I'd find my way over to the southeast corner where country A has 10 pennies, 0 nickels, and country B has 0 pennies, 5 nickels. These are all the corners. So in other words, this axis along the bottom is country A's pennies get bigger and bigger this way, and country B's pennies get bigger and bigger this way. Country A's nickels get bigger and bigger this way, and country B's nickels get bigger and bigger this way. So in other words, I've basically got two different origins, right? So I've got an origin down here that's country A, and then it's sort of like I flipped it for country B. So country B gets more and more as we go this way, and country A gets more and more as we go this way. And there's a finite number of resources, so the rectangle has finite dimension. 0, 10, 5. Consider an intermediate option. Let's say it was 5, 5, and 3, 2. So let's say that country A has 5 pennies, and country B has 5 pennies. And country A has 3 nickels. So this is country A, they've got 5 pennies and 3 nickels, and this is country B, they've got 5 pennies and 2 nickels. Well, that's this point right here. 5, 3, 5, 2. So this is pretty cool. This is a nice way to see two different commodities, it could be money and guns. It could be guns and butter. It could be cloth and wine. I'm not sure if you noticed, there's lots of commodities in the world. There's all sorts of different dimensions that countries care about. Even territory is two-dimensional, right? I mean, if we're looking at a map and we're trying to carve up the territory, then flat land is insufficient. We need 2 dimensions. So here's a 2-dimensional situation. And I can pin down an allocation, a distribution of multi-dimensional resources. I can pin down that allocation with some point in this box. This is called the Edgeworth box. Now, I don't want to have all these dots in front of me the whole time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us to 2 commodities that are infinitely divisible. So it'll just be like, it could go from 0 to 10, anywhere from 0 to 10. So let's say that we could chop things up in ways that I can't chop a penny up. So I can't chop this penny up. However, there are fractions of pennies involved in large transactions, right? So even if you buy gas, you'll notice that there are fractions of a penny involved. If you make a huge stock purchase, then chances are good that your price per share is going to involve fractions of pennies where that ends up with something meaningful just because of the multipliers. So let's say I could divide these pennies and divide these nickels. So I could go anywhere from 0 to 10 and anywhere from 0 to 5. Now I just have a nice clean rectangle, but I can still point a point anywhere in the space. And we'll say the idea is that country A wants allocations that are this way, and country B wants allocations that are this way. So country A gets happier and happier this way, and country B gets happier and happier this way. But notice that now it's a little bit more nuanced. Think about country A. We just said that they want to move more and more to the northeast. However, there's all sorts of different ways they could go. What if they like pennies a lot and nickels not very much? What if they get a lot more happiness out of pennies than they get out of nickels? Well, that's the case. Then yeah, they want to go northeast, but they prefer eastern northeasts to northern northeasts. They get happier faster in this direction if they like pennies more. And they get happier faster in this direction if they like nickels more. Right? So in other words, I need to come up with a way to convey the information that the states might not have perfectly symmetric preferences over these. They might prefer one commodity over another commodity. To do that, the easiest way to visualize something like that is for me to talk about the level sets or the indifferent sets for the countries. I'm gonna choose a bundle just arbitrarily. So here's a bundle for country A. I'm just gonna put it in this space. Boom. So here's a random amount. Maybe it's 3 and 2, right? So here's some amount of stuff for country A. Now the question is, what is the set of all other bundles, all other combinations of nickels and pennies that make country A indifferent between that bundle and this bundle? That's called a level set. I'm gonna draw it in. So now everywhere along this line, country A is indifferent. You can move me along this line and country A is indifferent. Now, if there's an alternative, if there's an alternative that country A strictly prefers, I could just move strictly to the northeast. But notice that there's a level set there too. Right? So in other words, this entire box you can view as a series of level sets, sort of like a topographical map. Right? So it's sort of like a topographical map. Imagine the utility is coming out of the screen at you, like a mountain does. And like with a map, I can't draw a mountain for you, but I can draw level sets of the mountain, places that are the same altitude everywhere, and that allows you to infer the shape of the mountain. So when something is very steep, the level sets are going to be very close, just like if you get a lot higher, a lot faster up a mountain. Whereas if something doesn't matter very much, it's going to have a little bit more of a gentle slope and the level sets will be further apart. Close level sets mean steep mountains mean more important commodity. So spaced out level sets mean less important commodities because it's more of a gentle hill. So this level set, this represents a lot. I can learn a lot about country A's preferences. That tells me everything I need to know about how country A feels about all of the possible nickel penny combinations in this space. We know they get happier this way, but that's not enough. I need to know more than that. I need to know how much they like nickels versus how much they like pennies. And the same for country B. But because we flip things around, country B's level sets are going to be shaped in the other direction. They get happier and happier as we go this way, and the level sets are going to be cupped the other way. Importantly, these countries get happier and happier as we go northeast and southwest. And the way that I've drawn these curves, they always prefer, like if I've got a level set like this, so here's a bundle and here's a bundle, and I'm indifferent between these bundles, but I strictly prefer the things inside, right? So the way that I'm gonna convey this message to you is I just want you to notice that countries always like to be on the inside of the curvy, right? So if I'm curved this way, country A wants to go more this way. And if I'm curved this way for country B wants to go more this way. They want to go inside the cup. They want to go inside the cup, okay? You'll see why I'm talking about this in a second. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, that was less than a second, is the following. Just consider some random bundle. Consider some random allocation of resources. Here it is. Boom. Let me draw country A's level set through that allocation. Zoom. And let me draw country B's level set through that allocation. Zoom. Right? So this is just an allocation. It's a way of divvying the resources, the pennies and nickels. I know it seems like a lot right now, but it really is. It's about getting this stupid thing really right. Here's a question for you. How would I know, using the tools just described, if this allocation is Pareto efficient? That's a tough question. What that would mean is, does there exist another allocation? Does there exist another allocation? Can you find another dot in the box? An allocation is just a dot in a box. Can you find another dot in the box where one country is strictly happier and the other country is no worse than weakly happier? They're no worse than indifferent. Maybe they're strictly happier too. Are there any opportunities for win-win from this allocation? And if so, how would you know? And if not, how would you know? Well, remember, from this allocation, country B wants to go this way inside the cup. And country A wants to go this way inside the cup. Now notice there's a little lens here. You see this lens? You see this lens? So right here, I've got a lens and it's defined by country A's level set here and country B's level set here. And there's this little lens inside. Do you see this lens? It goes like, ooh. Notice something with me. inside this lens, in the interior of this lens, country B would be strictly happier. I know the country B would be strictly happier because it's more to the southwest and inside the cup. And inside this lens, country A is strictly happier because it's northeast and inside the cup. So this lens, this set of alternatives, there's a whole set of allocations. Look at all these allocations in here. You see all the allocations in this lens? Well, everywhere inside this lens, both countries are strictly better off than they are at the allocation we started from. Which is to say, every allocation inside the lens, Pareto dominates the allocation that we drew. So this allocation is not Pareto efficient because I can find a whole lens of alternatives, a whole lens of allocations to strictly beat it. That's kind of cool, right? So in other words, if there's a lens, then it's not Pareto efficient because the lens is what Pareto dominates. If there's no lens, then nothing Pareto dominates and therefore it's Pareto optimal. So what would that look like? So let me consider some other allocation. And let me add country A's level set. And let me add country B's level set. Now there's no lens because these level sets, they just kiss. They just kiss one another, right? They just go, mwah, 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 mwah. For this you're paying. Mwah, mwah. You see that little, mwah. You see that? Now this allocation has tangent level sets. They don't overlap. They just barely touch. They just barely touch. Nothing Pareto dominates. Why? Because if I go anywhere northeasty, that makes country A happier, but country B strictly sadder. And if I go anywhere southwesty, that makes country B strictly happier, but country A strictly sadder. This is what Pareto efficiency looks like in the Edgeworth box. Pareto efficiency means tangent level sets in the Edgeworth box. How cool is that? Now, let me finish up with one final point then. You'll agree with me that the allocation where country B has everything and country A has nothing, that's this allocation. You'll agree with me that even though it's distributionally perverse, that allocation is Pareto efficient because I could not make any country happier without making another country sadder. I couldn't increase country A's stuff without taking away from country B. And I hope you'll also agree with me that the situation where country A has everything and country B has nothing is also Pareto optimal. Again, distributionally problematic, but here's a situation where country A has everything and country B has nothing. I couldn't give country B anything without taking away from country A. However, what happens in between is I wind up with this set of Pareto efficient alternatives that are characterized by all these little kissing level sets that happen, these little kissing indifference curves. So in the Edgeworth box, Pareto efficient outcomes emerge throughout the whole space. There's an infinite number of Pareto efficient outcomes, just like there was before. And it's still just a line, just like there was before. It's still just a one-dimensional object, just like before. But it's really enriched because now we're talking about how the two countries compare the two commodities. If country A really likes pennies and country B really likes nickels, then the Pareto efficient outcomes are gonna be one way. And if country A really likes nickels and country B really likes pennies, they're gonna come out another way. And if things shift intermediate, like if it depends on how much you have, then we're gonna see some interesting wiggles happening. But Pareto efficient outcomes, whether it's the frontier of a triangle or this wiggly line in a box, all that it is the set of outcomes where you couldn't make one party better off without making somebody else sadder. That can manifest itself lots of different ways depending on the substantive problem at hand. Now we're going to be talking about trade here in the Edgeworth box next week. And so I just want to make sure that you're comfortable with this strange, there's two different origins and all that sort of stuff. But hopefully the fact that we talked about one unified concept the entire time, what bargaining would look like in this box, what efficiency looks like in this box. I hope you're ready, because I'm going to have some very cool punchlines to tell you inside of this box next week. I'm not sure if you noticed, but we had some cool punchlines along the way, too. So what did we talk about today? Well, we talked about bargaining and optimality, and we started to flirt with the idea of trade too. We talked about the bargaining problem, which is something that we've all experienced, and it's also something we've all not experienced. We've all had to haggle with somebody that we care about on some important matter, where we had competing interests and where disagreement was costly. We've all also bought a Diet Coke, or something similar to it. And the literature on international relations, whether it's international political economy, international conflict, international organizations, or somewhere in between, has come to not the consensus, but there's a general view that bargaining processes play a really important part in international relations. So it's very important that we have a sense about what they are, what they do, what they look like. However, bargaining is not necessarily the only way that international relations proceeds. There are many interactions day to day that are not bargaining. All sorts of things transpire not because of how individual agents that had bargaining power interacted with one another, but rather because somebody meaningless like me makes a purchase somewhere, right? So we all own items that were made in other places. In that sense, we're all involved with international trade. But I didn't bargain for any of the things that I've purchased from other countries, right? And though some of the terms of those deals might be influenced by tariffs or trade deals or something like that, all that does is shift the pricing mechanism, and then we're still just in a market. Which is to say, any given international interaction involves some mix of something bargainy and something not so bargainy. And it's with this concept of not so bargainy in mind that I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. Let's say you have a Coke and I want it. There's a couple of different ways that I can get the Coke from you, right? Option one, I might offer you something. I'm like, hey, I've got some rooibos tea. Would you like some rooibos tea? And if you take this rooibos tea, then give me some of the Coke. Which is to say, I can come up with some deal. I can trade rooibos tea for Coca-Cola. Tempting right now. Although this is very good. Right? So I can try to exchange with you. I can offer you some amount. I can tacitly say, hey, there's a price that tells me how much tea it takes to buy a can of Coke. How many sips of tea per can of Coke are we trading at right now? What is the price in terms of rooibos tea that it takes to buy a Coca-Cola? And given that price, I can offer you some amount of rooibos tea to say, hey, I want that Coke from you. I'd like to buy that Coke from you. I'd like to exchange for your Coke. And presumably you wouldn't take the deal unless you liked what I was offering you in terms of rooibos tea more, at least as much and probably more than the Coke that you had. And I wouldn't make the offer of the rooibos tea that I'm willing to forego to get the Coca-Cola unless I'm happier with that outcome too. Which is to say, if I try to buy Coke from you with rooibos tea, it's a win-win. This is the first mechanism of transfer. It's called exchange. The way that we trade with one another, the way that we exchange items with one another is, sort of the economic mode of transfer. It is something that we do in markets. It is something that we study by studying pricing mechanisms and Walrasian auctioneers and all the different things that one studies in introductory microeconomics. Exchange, the win-win, the efficient mode of transfer, is one way that states, individuals, or anything in between can transfer resources with one another. There's another way I could have gotten the Coke off of you, though. I could have threatened you. I could have said, if you don't give me that Coke, I don't want to say I'm going to beat you up. I could have said, maybe less ethically, although it doesn't involve hitting, if you don't give me that Coke, I'm going to give you a bad grade in this class. That happens. People make threats. People issue ultimata. Here's the deal. Here's an offer. If you don't take that offer, I'm gonna take it off of you. Or I might just hit you and take the Coke after you've fallen down. Right? That's a possibility as well. Now look, in that situation, any Coke that you lost, you didn't get any compensation for the Coke that you lost. I got all the Coke, and you lost all the Coke, and you got no compensation. That was a zero-sum interaction. And probably in the process, some of the Coke got spilled, or you shook it a little bit, and so like the carbonation fizzed up a little bit. It's actually worse Coke. Or we have less Coke. That's the second mechanism of transfer. You might call it conflict. Conflict is what we use game theory to study. It's what we use political science to study. It's something that we talk about when we talk about legislative bargaining. We talk about conflict. So as best as I can tell, there are two mechanisms of transfer, the way of exchange and the way of conflict. What I love about teaching bargaining, optimality, and the Edgeworth box is it gives you an opportunity to see what they look like. Zero-summiness is what happens when we live on a Pareto frontier. If we use all of our resources, then the only way that I can get more of them is to take them off of you. There are no opportunities for win-win. I can't offer you rooibos for Coca-Cola. All I can do is threaten you. As I alluded to, the differences between the mechanism of exchange and the mechanism of conflict are somewhat disciplinary. In very broad brushstrokes, and this is less and less the case every day, economists, sort of the classic economic theory has been about the study of exchange and markets, and the study and political science has been about the study of transfer through all sorts of different conflictual interactions, most of which are oriented around bargaining. This also has implications for international relations theory. Realists tend to see the world only in terms of relative gains, which is to say, it is impossible for there to be win-win. There is no true win-win, even if we trade with one another in a win-win way, Roybus for Coca-Cola. If one of us does more better in that interaction, and I didn't misspeak there, if one of us does more better, then that person is the person that won the interaction. And if one of us does less better in the win-win, that is the person that lost the interaction. To a realist, there is no such thing as win-win. There are only relative gains in very broad brushstrokes. To a liberal, on the other hand, liberals who are oftentimes influenced by classic economic theory, there are all sorts of opportunities for win-win in the world. There are absolute gains everywhere. It's therefore easier for liberals to talk about exchange and for realists to talk about conflict. Easier in the sense that it's more natural given the vocabularies that they developed within each of the pagodas of their respective religions. So conflict and exchange help us to disentangle markets from bargaining. They help us to disentangle economics from political science. They help us to disentangle the Walrasian equilibrium of a market from the Nash equilibrium of a game. We haven't talked about any of that just yet. You'll see what I mean in a second. And by a second, I mean 5 weeks. They help us to disentangle realism and liberalism. They help us to disentangle all sorts of different things in a bunch of stupid different pictures. A rectangle and a triangle, and I just talked to you about realism versus liberalism, economics versus political science, markets versus bargaining. All of it is about where you think we are and how you think we ought to adjudicate among different places in a triangle or a rectangle. That's it. However, none of this is really the provocative thought. All I've done is delineate two mechanisms of transfer which are generally agreed upon. Most people view the world as either a world constituted of exchange. These people tend to be rosier in their views. They tend to be more liberal. They are more sanguine about how the world is going to proceed. And some people tend to view the world as one characterized by conflict. These are the more cynical, the more realist, and so on. But who said you had to choose? States interact with one another constantly and in myriad ways. Some of those ways that they interact with one another are very exchangey. They trade. Some of the ways they interact with one another are very conflicty. They fight, or they sanction, or they threaten. However, it doesn't appear to me that it is ever the case that states are entirely conflictual or entirely exchangey with one another. Any given moment in time is comprised of some mix of the two. But in general, the laws of physics that have been developed in the study of conflict and the laws of physics that have been developed in the study of exchange have been two distinct laws of physics. An interesting question is, do you think that bargaining, that markets, can be embedded into one set of physics? Do you think that conflict and exchange can be embedded into one set of physics? Do you think that realism and liberalism can be embedded into one set of physics? Do you think economics and political science can be embedded into one set of physics? It's a tough question. And there isn't any one right answer. This is just something that's on my mind pretty often. I love to teach bargaining because it helps you to see just how many different ways there are to see. In the introduction, I refer to this as sort of the underlying geometry of international relations, and I think that's true about a lot of this. I think that there's a lot to be learned just by staring at triangles and waiting for osmosis to happen. You know, somewhere inside of that triangle is some deep insight that once it hits you, you'll never unlearn it. Something inside that stupid rectangle, there's some insight that once you see it, you'll never unlearn it. There's an underlying geometry to all of this. And inside of the ways that we interact with these stupid shapes, somewhere in the space in between our eye and our mind and the stupid shape on the screen, somewhere in that space is our interpretation of it, our ability to see it as conflictual or as exchangey or as both. I'm saying all this because I don't want creativity to be something that just is about fun for you. Creativity is super fun, don't get me wrong. But creativity is also about allowing all sorts of different things to happen in between your mind's eye and the stupid shape that you find on the screen. Creativity is about being able to see the same thing many different ways. You may then wonder, why is creativity important? And I feel myself choking up even thinking about it. It's important because if you can't see things multiple ways, then you'll never be able to talk to anybody. Because to truly talk to somebody, you have to begin to see things their way too. It's important because there's nothing more fun than taking on some problem that you think is really important with somebody else and being able to talk to them in a meaningful way, to be able to exchange information with them in a meaningful way, to be able to talk about a fable with them. Moreover, creativity is the thing that will allow you to find solutions that you didn't know existed in some stupid shape. Is the thing that will help you to see something in a shape looks potentially useful. What are all the different manifestations of that in the real world? How do I move not just from the real world to the shape, but from the shape back to the real world? That's an act of creativity too. I say all this because, I was a political science major, and I know that many of you are too. This is something that I think is more important to us than we realize. The ability to turn phenomena into shapes and shapes back into phenomena. The ability to turn history into fables and fables back into history. I think this is a really important juncture when you see all these interesting tensions and all these interesting juxtapositions in the context of one stupid picture. If this isn't the best chance for you to see that there's an opportunity for you to improve the way that you turn reality into the abstract and the abstract back into reality, then I don't know that you're ever going to see that lesson, because this is as clear as it gets. I hope that you saw it today. And no matter what, thanks for watching.